When the videos first landed in my inbox, my heart skipped a beat, not from the shock of seeing my wife Emma entangled in someone else's arms, but from the burning clarity it brought me. This wasn't a mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment, or a fleeting affair that I could just look away from. It was a series of explicit betrayals, different men in different places. The one constant? Her smile, a smile I thought belonged only to me, twisted now into something I could hardly recognize. It all started so subtly, so innocently. Emma, my wife of 7 years, began working late. She's a masseuse, and when she told me her clients were booking her for evening sessions, I didn't think much of it. After all, the industry thrives on flexible hours and loyal customers seeking relief at the end of their long days. She'd come home late, sometimes after I was already in bed. I'd wake up to the scent of her shampoo, a smile on her lips as she slipped under the covers. "Tough day?" I'd ask. She'd nod, her eyes tired but content. I believed her. I had no reason not to. Then she started coming home with gifts. Small trinkets at first, a new bracelet, an expensive bottle of wine. I asked where she got them, and she'd laugh, saying a grateful client had given her a tip. I should have noticed how she avoided my eyes when she said it. I should have noticed the way she'd tense up when her phone buzzed with a message, the way she'd excuse herself to the bathroom to answer it. But I was blind, wrapped up in my own routine, in the comfort of our shared life. It wasn't until I got the videos that everything snapped into focus. They came from an anonymous number, unmarked and untraceable. The first message was simple: "You deserve to know." I remember staring at it for a long moment, trying to make sense of what it could mean. And then I opened the first video. It was her, clear as day, in a hotel room I didn't recognize, wearing the lingerie I'd bought her for our anniversary last year. My throat tightened as I watched her kiss a man, not in the tender way she kissed me, but with a hunger I hadn't seen in years. The next video was worse. A different man this time, in what looked like the back seat of a car. Her laughter filled the small space, a sound that used to bring me so much joy but now felt like a knife twisting in my gut. They weren't just having sex, they were enjoying themselves in ways I never imagined. It was playful, it was passionate, and it was raw. My Emma was unrecognizable, a stranger wrapped in the body of the woman I loved. I couldn't breathe. My hands shook as I clicked on the third video, hoping for some sign, some hint that this wasn't real. But it was. This time, she was in a spa, one I didn't know she visited. The man, older and balding, leaned back as she worked her hands over his shoulders, her touch intimate in a way that was never just professional. It wasn't a massage, it was foreplay. I could see it in her eyes, in the way she leaned in closer, her lips brushing his ear as she whispered something I couldn't make out. My blood ran cold. I wanted to throw my phone across the room, to delete everything and pretend I never saw it. But I couldn't. I watched every second, every agonizing frame. And when it was over, I sat there, staring at the wall, feeling the world spin around me. I couldn't tell what hurt more, the betrayal itself or the ease with which she carried it out, the practiced smiles, the light touches, the laughter. That night, I didn't confront her. Instead, I watched her sleep, her face soft and peaceful, as if she had nothing to hide. I replayed the videos in my mind, the scenes overlapping with memories of us, our wedding day, the first time we kissed, the night she told me she was pregnant. It was all tainted now, every moment colored by the images I couldn't unsee. The next morning, she acted like nothing had changed. She kissed me on the cheek, humming as she made coffee, and asked me if I wanted pancakes for breakfast. I wanted to scream at her, to demand she explain herself, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. Instead, I told her I had to leave for work early and slipped out before she could see the storm brewing in my eyes. I spent the day planning. If I was going to confront her, I needed more than just anger. I needed a strategy, a plan that would make sure she felt the same kind of betrayal I was drowning in. As the hours ticked by, My mind spiraled with possibilities. I could ruin her, expose her to everyone she knew, make sure every man in those videos faced consequences too. But as satisfying as that thought was, it wasn't enough. I needed something bigger, something that would leave her as broken as she'd left me. By the time I got home, I had a plan. Emma was waiting for me, dressed in the new lingerie I'd bought her last Christmas, her smile warm and inviting. I almost laughed at the irony. "Hey, babe," she said, her voice light, as if nothing had changed. "How was your day?" "Fine," I lied, my voice calm. "Better now that I'm home." I kissed her, savoring the taste of her lips one last time, knowing it was the last kiss I'd ever give her without hate behind it. The next step of my plan was already in motion. I'd booked a surprise weekend getaway, just for us, to a luxury cabin in the mountains. She lit up when I told her, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Oh, Jack, that sounds amazing!" she exclaimed, throwing her arms around me. I hugged her back, smiling over her shoulder, already picturing the look on her face when she realized what was coming next. It wasn't love I felt anymore. It was cold, calculated rage. As I held Emma in my arms, feeling the warmth of her embrace, a part of me wanted to believe that this was just a nightmare, that I could wake up and everything would be fine again. But the videos burned in my memory, like a brand I couldn't erase. No, this wasn't a bad dream. It was a stark, brutal reality, and I was done being a fool. Over the next few days, I played my part perfectly. I laughed at her jokes, kissed her good night, and pretended everything was fine. Inwardly, I was seething. Each smile I gave her another step closer to the inevitable confrontation. I knew her routine well enough by now. Her late nights, her sudden, unexplained trips to the spa, the frequent work emergencies that always seemed to pop up at the most inconvenient times. I watched it all unfold with a quiet fury, letting her dig her own grave a little deeper each day. The cabin getaway was set for the following weekend, and Emma was thrilled. She spent hours packing, choosing outfits, and talking about how we needed this time together, just the two of us. I could see the excitement in her eyes, but it was empty to me now, just another layer of her deception. I smiled and nodded, making all the right noises, while inside, my anger simmered hotter and more volatile with each passing second. The morning of our departure arrived, and I loaded up the car. Emma was practically bouncing with excitement, chattering away about how much she was looking forward to some alone time, away from the stresses of daily life. I listened, nodding along, letting her believe everything was normal. We drove in silence for a while, the winding mountain roads offering a kind of peace I hadn't felt in weeks. The sun was setting as we pulled up to the cabin, a secluded, cozy place surrounded by tall pines. It was beautiful, exactly the kind of place where we'd spent so many happy weekends together before. But this time was different. This time, it wasn't love that brought us here. Emma stepped out of the car, breathing in the crisp mountain air, her eyes shining as she took in the view. "It's perfect, Jack," she said, turning to smile at me. "Thank you for this. I needed it." "I know," I replied, my voice calm, almost gentle. "I needed it too." We settled in, unpacked our bags, and she started preparing dinner while I lit the fireplace. The cabin was warm, filled with the crackle of the fire and the scent of pine. Emma poured us each a glass of wine, and we sat together on the couch, her head resting on my shoulder. It felt almost like old times, the comfort of her body next to mine, the illusion of normalcy. But I couldn't forget the truth, not even for a second. As we finished dinner, I pulled out my phone. It was time. I opened the video gallery, the folder labeled innocuously as Memories. My hands were steady, my heart cold. I slid the phone across the table to her. "I thought we could watch something together," I said, my voice level. Emma picked up the phone, her smile faltering slightly as she looked at the screen. "What's this?" she asked, confusion flickering across her face. "Just press play," I said, leaning back in my chair, watching her intently. She hesitated for a moment, then tapped the screen. The first video started playing, and I watched her face closely, every flicker of emotion as she realized what she was seeing. Her eyes widened, her smile slipping away entirely. Her hand flew to her mouth as the video continued, her face draining of color. "Jack, what is this?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Keep watching," I said, my tone hardening. "There's more." She looked at me, a wild, desperate plea in her eyes, but I didn't relent. She watched as the second video played, then the third, each one more damning than the last. By the time the final video ended, she was shaking, tears streaming down her face. She set the phone down on the table, her hands trembling. "Jack, she began, but I cut her off. "Don't," I snapped, my voice like ice. "Don't you dare try to explain this away. I've seen everything, Emma. Every single disgusting, pathetic lie you've told me. I know about all of it." She collapsed back into her chair, her face contorted in shock and fear. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I never meant for this to happen. It just—" "Save it," I spat, standing up and looming over her. "You didn't just slip up, Emma. You made a choice. Over and over again, you chose to betray me, to humiliate me. You lied to my face and then had the audacity to act like everything was fine, like you still loved me." "I do love you," she cried, reaching out for me, but I stepped back, out of her reach. "Don't touch me," I snarled. "You don't get to say that. Not after what you did. You love me? Then why did you do it, Emma?" She broke down then, sobbing, her face buried in her hands. "I don't know," she choked out. "I was lonely, I was bored, and I felt trapped. It happened, and I couldn't stop." I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You couldn't stop?" I repeated. "No, Emma, you chose not to stop. And now, you get to live with the consequences." "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice small, terrified. I turned away from her, pulling a set of papers from my bag and tossing them onto the table. "Divorce papers," I said. "Already filled out. You'll sign them before we leave this cabin, or I'll send those videos to everyone you know, your friends, your family, even your clients. I'll make sure they all see exactly who you are." She stared at the papers, her face a mask of horror. "You wouldn't," she whispered. "Try me," I said coldly. "You've spent months making a fool out of me, Emma. Now it's your turn." She sank to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. I watched her, feeling nothing but a cold, empty satisfaction. This was what she deserved, and it was only the beginning. The cabin was silent except for her cries, the fire crackling softly in the background. I stood there, looking down at the woman I once loved, feeling nothing but the weight of her betrayal. And for the first time since I'd seen those videos, I felt a strange, hollow sense of peace. I looked down at her, a sobbing, crumpled mess on the floor. It was strange to see her this way. Emma had always been strong, composed. She was the woman who faced everything with a calm smile, who laughed in the face of adversity. Now she was broken, and I was the one who had shattered her. I thought I'd feel victorious. I thought I'd feel some kind of release. Instead, all I felt was emptiness. She lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen. "Jack, please," she whimpered, her voice barely audible. "You can't do this. You can't just end it like this." I crouched down to her level, looking her dead in the eyes. "You did this, Emma," I said, my voice low but sharp. "Every time you lied to me, every time you went behind my back, you drove another nail into this coffin. I'm just the one burying it." She reached for my hand, but I pulled it away. The desperation in her eyes was unmistakable now, and it brought a dark satisfaction to the pit of my stomach. "I made a mistake," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I know I did. But it wasn't about you, Jack. It was never about you." I laughed bitterly. "Oh, so it wasn't about me?" I snapped, standing up and pacing the room. I'm supposed to believe that you sneaking off to screw other men, wearing the lingerie I bought you, wasn't about me? That it wasn't about humiliating me every time you lied straight to my face? It wasn't like that, she screamed, her voice shrill, filled with a raw kind of pain I'd never heard from her before. I was lost, Jack. I felt like I was drowning in this life, in the routine, and I needed to feel something. I turned to face her, fury boiling beneath my skin. You needed to feel something? So, what was I then, Emma? Just the guy paying the bills, keeping the house in order while you went out to feel something with whoever you could find? It wasn't like that, she repeated, shaking her head violently, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if she needed it to hold herself upright. I wasn't looking for it. It just happened. I grabbed the edge of the table and flipped it over, sending dishes and glasses crashing to the floor. The sound echoed through the cabin, the silence that followed almost deafening. It didn't just happen, I shouted, my voice echoing off the wooden walls. You chose this, Emma. Every single time, you chose this. She flinched at my words, her body trembling as she stared at the broken glass scattered across the floor. You don't understand, she whispered, her voice small and hollow. You don't know what it's like to feel like you're invisible. Like no one sees you anymore. I felt a stab of something then, a fleeting moment of pity, but I crushed it down. Invisible? I spat. Is that your excuse? I never stopped looking at you, Emma. I never stopped loving you. But you were too busy pretending to be someone else, too busy screwing around to notice. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't bother wiping them away. I never wanted to hurt you, she said, her voice thick with tears. I didn't plan for any of this. That's the thing, Emma, I said, stepping closer, lowering my voice. You didn't plan it, but you let it happen. You let it happen over and over again, and you never once thought about me. About us. She looked up at me, her expression a twisted mask of guilt and pain. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry, Jack. I shook my head slowly. Sorry isn't good enough, I said, my voice flat. Sorry doesn't erase the images I have burned into my mind. It doesn't fix the nights I spent wondering what was wrong, why you were pulling away from me. It doesn't change the fact that you destroyed everything we built together. She collapsed onto the floor, sobbing into her hands. I watched her for a moment, feeling nothing but a cold, detached anger. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, thought about all the things I'd say, the satisfaction I'd feel seeing her like this. But now that it was happening, it all felt hollow. I walked over to the door and picked up my coat. Sign the papers, Emma, I said quietly, without looking back at her. By the time we leave this cabin, I want you out of my life. She looked up, her eyes wide and panicked. What are you saying? You can't mean that. We can fix this, Jack. Please, we can go to counseling. We can work through this. I turned to face her one last time, the weight of everything crashing down on me. There's nothing left to fix, I said coldly. You made sure of that. With that, I walked out the door, slamming it behind me. The night air hit me like a punch, the cold seeping into my bones, but I welcomed it. I needed the chill, needed something to shock me out of the numbness that had settled inside me. I leaned against the side of the cabin, looking up at the sky. It was clear, the stars scattered like tiny diamonds across the velvet black. It was beautiful, serene, a stark contrast to the chaos inside me. I could hear her crying through the door, her sobs muffled but unmistakable. For a brief, fleeting moment, I almost turned back. Almost. But then I remembered the videos, the way she had smiled at them, the way she had looked at those men. It was the same smile she used to give me, once upon a time. That was when I knew there was no going back. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the folder again, scrolling through the images and videos one last time. I'd save them, not because I needed proof, but as a reminder. A reminder of what betrayal looked like, of what it felt like to trust someone completely, only to have them rip that trust away. The door creaked open behind me, and Emma stepped out, her face streaked with tears, her eyes red and swollen. She looked smaller somehow, fragile in a way I'd never seen before. "Jack," she whispered, her voice broken. "Please don't leave me like this." I looked at her, really looked at her for what felt like the first time in ages. And I realized then that I didn't love her anymore. I didn't even hate her. I felt nothing at all. "Goodbye, Emma," I said softly, turning away from her. I walked into the night, leaving her standing there in the cold, alone with her regrets. "Jack," Emma's voice called out, shaky and broken. "Please, just listen to me. We can't end things like this." I said nothing, staring off into the dark forest that surrounded us. The silence stretched between us, heavy and unbearable. I could feel her eyes on my back, her desperation thick in the air. 4 years, that voice had been my comfort, my sanctuary. Now, it felt like nails on a chalkboard, a grating reminder of everything we had lost. "Say something," she yelled, her voice rising, edged with a raw kind of hysteria I hadn't heard from her before. "You can't just walk away like this." I turned slightly, just enough to meet her eyes. "Watch me," I said coldly. Her face crumpled, and she stepped forward, reaching out as if she could somehow pull me back with a touch. "I'm begging you, Jack," she sobbed. "We can fix this. I made a mistake. I know that. But I love you. I've always loved you." I shook my head slowly, my voice deadpan. "Love? Is that what you call this?" "No, Emma, you don't get to use that word anymore. Not after everything you've done." Her tears fell harder, her body racked with sobs. But I felt nothing. Not pity, not sympathy, just an overwhelming numbness. I turned away from her again, signaling the end of the conversation. I was done. But she wasn't. "You bastard!" she screamed suddenly, her voice splitting the night air like a whip. I turned back just in time to see the shift in her eyes. They weren't pleading anymore. They were wild, frenzied, filled with a desperate, raw fury that I hadn't seen before. In an instant, she lunged at me. I barely had time to react before she was on me, her nails digging into my face, her hands clawing at my neck. The force of her attack sent us both stumbling backward, and I slammed into the wooden railing of the porch. The pain was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the shock of her assault. Emma, the woman I once loved, was now a rabid, frenzied mess, her face twisted in a mask of rage and agony. "You think you can just leave me?" she screamed, her voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable. "After everything we've been through, you think you can just walk away like I'm nothing?" I grabbed her wrists, trying to pry her hands away from my throat. Her nails raked across my skin, leaving deep, burning scratches. "Emma, stop!" I shouted, my voice strained as I struggled to break free from her grip. But she was relentless, driven by a kind of madness I'd never seen in her before. "You're not going to leave me!" she shrieked, her eyes wild, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I won't let you!" She pushed me again, slamming me hard against the cabin wall. My head snapped back, hitting the wood with a dull thud. Stars burst in my vision, and for a moment I felt a flash of genuine fear. This wasn't the woman I knew. This was a stranger, someone unhinged, feral. I managed to push her off me, stumbling forward to put some distance between us. "Get a grip, Emma," I yelled. "What the hell is wrong with you?" "What's wrong with me?" she spat, her voice dripping with venom. She was panting, her hair wild, her chest heaving as if she had run a marathon. "You're the one walking away, throwing everything we've built together in the trash like it means nothing." I squared my shoulders, taking a step toward her. "You threw it away first," I said, my voice like ice. "Every time you snuck off, every time you lied to me, you made your choice. And now I'm making mine." "Forget it!" she screamed, lunging at me again. This time, I was ready. I grabbed her shoulders and twisted, using her momentum against her. She spun, stumbling to the edge of the porch, where she caught herself on the railing. She turned back to face me, her eyes blazing with a fury that seemed almost inhuman. "You're not leaving me, Jack," she snarled. "I won't let you go. I can't. You're mine." Her words hit me like a slap. I had seen glimpses of this possessive side of her before, but nothing like this. This was something darker, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for a long time, hidden by the mask of the loving wife she had once been. "You don't own me," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "And you never will." She let out a scream of frustration, throwing herself at me one last time. I caught her wrists mid-air, holding her back with a grip that was harder than I intended. For a second, we stood there, locked in a twisted dance, her face inches from mine, her breath hot and ragged against my skin. "Let go of me," she hissed, her eyes narrowing into slits. "Gladly," I replied, shoving her back. She stumbled, falling hard onto the wooden planks of the porch. For a moment, she just lay there, breathing heavily, her chest heaving as if she'd just run a mile. I took a step back, my hands clenched into fists, every muscle in my body tense and ready for whatever she might do next. But she didn't move. Instead, she looked up at me, her face crumpling as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "You can't leave me," she whispered, her voice broken now, the anger gone, replaced by a hollow, desperate plea. "Please, Jack, don't leave me." I shook my head slowly, looking down at her with a mixture of pity and disgust. "I already have," I said softly. "You just don't know it yet." With that, I turned away and walked down the steps, leaving her sobbing on the porch, her cries echoing into the night. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I felt the weight of her betrayal lift from my shoulders with each step I took away from her. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was freedom. And for the first time in months, I breathed freely, finally stepping into a future without her. Emma's sobs filled the night air, echoing through the trees like the cries of a wounded animal. I didn't turn back, didn't let myself feel the pain in her voice. I couldn't afford to any more. I needed to be done. I needed to put an end to this once and for all. I reached the car, leaned against it for a moment, and took a deep breath. My heart was pounding, my pulse a rapid drumbeat in my ears. I closed my eyes, trying to find some semblance of calm, some tiny piece of resolve I could hold on to. This was it. There was no turning back now. I knew what had to be done, and I was ready. Pushing off the car, I walked back up the steps, each one heavier than the last. Emma was still on the porch, curled into herself, her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked so small, so broken. For a split second, a flicker of pity ran through me. But it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the cold, hard realization of everything she had done. I couldn't afford pity. Not now. "Emma," I said, my voice flat and emotionless. She didn't respond, just kept sobbing quietly, her body shaking with each breath. "Emma, look at me." Slowly, she lifted her head. Her face was a mess, tear-streaked, her eyes red and swollen, her makeup smeared. She looked nothing like the confident, beautiful woman I had once loved. She looked lost, like a child who had been abandoned in the woods. "I need you to sign the papers," I said, my voice firm. I pulled the divorce papers from my bag and held them out to her. "This is the last time I'm going to ask." Her eyes flicked to the papers, and I saw a flash of panic there, a wild, desperate light. "No," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "No, I can't. Please, Jack, don't do this. We can fix it. I'll do anything, I swear. Just don't end it like this." I crouched down in front of her, leveling my gaze with hers. "You already ended it, Emma," I said quietly. "You ended it the first time you went behind my back. The first time you lied to me. All I'm doing now is putting the final nail in the coffin." Sign the papers." She reached out, her hands trembling, trying to grab onto my shirt, but I pulled back, out of her reach. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "I love you. I'll change. I'll be better. Just give me one more chance." I felt a cold, bitter smile tug at the corner of my lips. "You've had your chances," I said. "More than you deserved. And you threw every single one of them away." Her face crumpled, and she let out a wail of despair, her hands clutching at her own hair as if she could tear out the pain by the roots. "You're destroying us," she sobbed. "You're throwing everything away." I stood up, towering over her, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. "No, Emma," I said. "You did that. And now you need to live with it." I tossed the papers onto the porch, the pen landing beside them with a soft clink. "Sign them," I ordered, my voice cold and final. "Or I'll make sure everyone sees those videos. Your family, your friends, your clients, everyone." Her eyes went wide with horror, and she covered her mouth with her hand, a choked sob escaping her lips. "You wouldn't," she whispered. "Try me," I said, turning on my heel and walking back into the cabin. I didn't slam the door behind me. I closed it quietly, sealing myself off from the sound of her crying. Inside, the cabin was still warm, the fire casting a soft, golden glow over the room. I sat down in the armchair by the fireplace, staring into the flames, watching them dance and flicker. I tried to let the warmth thaw the ice that had settled inside my chest, but it wouldn't budge. The numbness was too deep, too complete. Minutes ticked by, stretching into what felt like hours. I didn't move, barely even breathed, just listened to the crackle of the fire and the occasional soft sound of Emma's crying outside. Finally, the door creaked open, and she stepped inside. She looked even worse than before, her face blotchy and swollen, her eyes hollow. She was clutching the divorce papers in her hand, the pen dangling loosely between her fingers. "I signed them," she whispered, her voice so soft I almost didn't hear it. I nodded, feeling nothing but a cold, hollow satisfaction. "Good," I said. "Leave them on the table." She walked over, her steps unsteady, and placed the papers on the coffee table. Then she just stood there, staring down at them, her body swaying slightly as if she might collapse. "Is this really it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "After everything, this is how it ends?" "This is how you ended it," I corrected. "I'm just cleaning up your mess." She nodded slowly, as if she were finally accepting it. Then she sank down onto the couch, curling up into a ball, her face buried in her hands. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice muffled by her sobs. "I'm so sorry. I didn't respond. I couldn't." There was nothing left to say. I watched her for a moment longer, then turned away, heading for the bedroom. I grabbed my bag, threw in a few clothes, and slipped my phone into my pocket. I could hear her crying still, but it was softer now, almost like she was falling asleep. I walked back into the living room, standing over her for one last moment. She was curled up on the couch, her body shaking with silent sobs, her eyes closed, tears streaking down her cheeks. It was a pitiful sight, and for a brief moment I almost felt a flicker of pity again. Almost. But I squashed it down, buried it deep. This was the woman who had betrayed me, who had lied to me over and over again. I couldn't afford to feel anything for her any more. "Goodbye, Emma," I whispered, so softly she couldn't hear it. I turned and walked out of the cabin, closing the door quietly behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I slipped into the car, started the engine, and drove away, the sound of the tires crunching on gravel the only noise in the silent night. As I made my way down the dark, winding road, a strange sense of peace settled over me. It wasn't joy or relief, nothing that simple. It was the feeling of finally, irrevocably cutting loose the weight that had been dragging me down. I was free. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I breathed easily.